I think that this is vibes. This is the stuff that actually matters to most people now. So hi, this is the workshop, and I'm now getting started. So my name is Ian. I already said that. And I would encourage you all to turn on your cameras if you so wish. If you don't want to, that's fine as well. But yes, this workshop is about effective rebuttal, and I will be focusing on both of these terms and sort of what each one of them mean. So to start us off, I think that it's quite important to get a sort of groundwork on why we rebut things. So why rebut things at all? And this is sort of the purpose of all your rebuttals, right? Because debates are not determined by who has the best argument, but rather who has the most impactful arguments left standing relative to the other team. So oftentimes as a coach and as a debater myself, I will obsess over argumentation. I've done first speaker before, and at that point in the debate, you might be very, very concerned about like how good your own arguments are. But debates aren't really about that, actually. They're not about who had the best arguments at the start. In fact, a lot of the times I will listen to debates and go, okay, proposition clearly has much better arguments than opposition at the start, right? But debates are won or lost, right, based on the end of the debate, essentially. So you almost think of it as the end of the debate being really, really where judges will start making their decisions rather than the start, right? Even if judges can have an idea of how the debate will go later on, but this is not first speaker workshop. Debates are sort of decided on who has the best one at the end. So I'll just explain this using a quick allegory. Let's say you had a sandcastle building competition, right? And you saw these two sandcastles. So probably, let's say proposition has one on the left, opposition has one on the right. Probably you think proposition would win, right? Because they've clearly got a better sandcastle. However, the thing about debate is that it's not just about who can build the better sandcastle, it's about who can sort of knock down each other's sandcastle. It's an activity where you can effectively respond to the other team's case as well. So imagine that after building these sandcastles, right, you have a opportunity to go and attack the other team's sandcastle. So opposition comes in and knocks down proposition's sandcastle to the point whereby it becomes from that to that, right? So it's much smaller. And so if I were to decide the debate or decide the competition, then I would probably decide opposition would win. And then proposition then gets to attack opposition's sandcastle, and it becomes like that. Probably, right, relative to each other, let's say this is the end of the competition, proposition didn't take it because clearly smaller, right? So what I'm trying to show here is that rebuttals are essentially a way for you to attack the other team's case and to defend your own case against attacks. So it's almost as if you can rebuild your own sandcastle to try to make it seem bigger and to show the judge that attacks were not really done onto you. Yeah. So give me a sec. So now moving on to sort of what is not an effective rebuttal. And so there are 4 types of rebuttals that I think generally sort of exemplify, right, what is not something that's effective or something that will not end up actually diminishing the other team's sandcastle. It's almost as if you wasted the time in your speech, essentially, if you do these things. Number 1, a complete lack of rebuttal. And so this is the I think that this is the most obvious thing to say, but as a judge and as a coach, sometimes you will see teams do this, right? They hear an argument, they're not quite sure how to respond, so they pretend it never existed. Don't do that, because if you do that, right, then clearly in school style especially, or in sort of the secondary school circuit especially, judges which hear no response at all assume that you have essentially agreed to the other team's argument, or you have no ability to respond at all. And so they end up having to believe what was said, because judges are told to be, sort of neutral third-person observers. We don't enter the debate. And so even if the argument isn't ultra believable and I'm still on the fence about it, if it hasn't been rebutted, then I will have to let it stand. Therefore, any attempt at rebuttal is still almost always better than no attempt at all. A second type of ineffective rebuttal is a rebuttal that simply repeats your own argument. And there are instances where you can use your own argument as part of rebuttal, and that's when I talk about outweighing another team's argument later on, right? But if you simply repeat your own argument and go, well, it is true that X is true, but Y is also true, and therefore you should side with us, that doesn't really add anything to the debate because it's in effect, right, the same as if you simply had not made that rebuttal to begin with. Does that make sense? It's almost as if you're just repeating your own argument then. The third type of rebuttal that is not effective, but it's still better. So it's almost as if these rebuttals are consecutively better, right? It's when you assert the opposite of what the other team is saying, but then don't back it up. So for instance, let's say a motion is this helps with ban school exams. A rebuttal prop argument, a government bench argument might be school exams cause stress, right? An opposition might say no, school exams aren't that stressful, and then move on. Doing so does not give the judge a persuasive reason why they should believe you over the government bench. So for example, if the gov bench argues school exams are stressful because kids put their entire self-esteem on it, they cry, they might hurt themselves, they might commit to extreme studying tactics which are not productive and hurt their mental health and stop them from sleeping. All of these things might likely cause stress. An opposition rebuttal to this that says that no, school exams don't really cause stress, I'm not that stressed when I do exams, it's not effective because it doesn't give any counter analysis or any other reason why students are not stressed. It simply asserts the opposite of what prop has said. And if prop has more reasons in their argument, and logically speaking, if you have to fit your own arguments in there, prop's arguments as well, they likely have more material there. Yeah. So they're likely going to be on the back foot if you do this. The fourth is something that I noticed I was guilty of in a recent tournament. So you're learning from my mistakes, I suppose. Rebuttals that fail to represent the other team's arguments accurately. So this is when you either don't quite get the logic of the other team's argument, or you simplify it too much, or you just are not quite sure how to hit an argument, and so you sort of go, okay, I'll try to make a similar sounding argument that I'll then hit. There's some instances where that might work. So for example, if the other team's argument is really, really poor, building up a stronger version of the argument might require you to give them more logic than they actually said. But doing the opposite of that, taking away their logic and pretending that they said something more simplistic, is what we call straw manning or straw personing, I suppose, an argument. And that does not really constitute an effective rebuttal, because the judge might still believe the initial argument. It's just that the argument you've rebutted was not made. And so the judge will not believe that that was the real argument that should be gotten rid of. So these are essentially examples of what is considered ineffective rebuttal as compared to more effective ones we'll talk about later on. By the way, the way I do lessons and sort of coaching is if at any point anybody has any questions, you can essentially turn on your camera, unmute yourself, send a question in a chat, send it to me directly. Anything that would allow me to see that there is a question will likely get my attention, and I will very happily sort of pause and answer and reply. There will be a Q&A at the end, so if you have a question that's sort of overarching and you think that I wouldn't be able to address it like in the middle of an idea or a thought, you can give it to me then as well. Yeah. Okay, so with the ideas of an ineffective rebuttal in mind, how do you then make a more effective rebuttal? So I found that this rebuttal structure generally works pretty well for me. This isn't set in stone, meaning to say that if you really think that you want to add more steps or take away some steps, although I'm a bit more hesitant to take them away than add them, by all means, but this is generally the structure that works for me and most exercises, tournaments, speeches, etc. So let me give you an idea of how I probably, so it consists of 4 parts basically. Firstly, sort of just giving a label of a rebuttal, right? Or a label of an argument really. So the other team's first argument was that exams cause stress, for example. The exact logic was that, and then you add on some generally what you think the logic was. Just a couple of lines to summarize it, preferably, right? However, and then you give a rebuttal outcome. And I'll talk about rebuttal outcomes later, right? What different types of rebuttals try to prove, which is actually quite important to sort of go, okay, have I taken out this argument altogether? Have I sort of given myself a path to victory, really? And then you substantiate. So like, this is because X. So to sort of see this in motion, in any random motion, this house would ban cars in big cities, right? Um, so the other team's first argument was that banning cars in big cities would allow for a better environment. The exact logic was that cars release emissions, and that banning these emissions and cars in big cities would decrease traffic jams, reducing the emissions by creating more efficient bus systems. However, the opposite is true. In reality, banning all cars will lead towards a massive increase in carbon emissions. This is because when all cars are banned, governments around the world would then have to replace these cars with buses and MRT systems or monorail transit systems, and the construction of these systems would cost lots of money but also release lots of carbon in the air, because industrialization and construction and manufacturing all of these vehicles always causes carbon waste. And the process of doing so will ultimately hurt the environment in such a great amount that it's better than if we just try to stick to cars and make them more energy efficient. So the 4-step process allows you to sort of get the judge really, really clear on exactly what you're hitting, what you're trying to prove when you're hitting it, and the outcomes. So if you want to, so that's a structure that I think works very well for most very basic rebuttals. Now, many debaters, myself included, like to tier rebuttals or to give leveled rebuttals. And a classic example of this is when a debater goes up and says, I have 7 responses to the first team's argument. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. And if you want to do that using this structure, that's perfectly legit. What you then do is you repeat number 3 and number 4. I'm not quite sure if you can see my mouse. But you end up repeating number 3 and number 4. So for example, the exact logic was that cars cause more environmental damage. However, I've got 4 responses to this. The first is that this is not true. This is because cars, cars are not that environmentally damaging. Buses are actually more environmentally damaging. That's actually not true, but whatever. Secondly, actually, we even think that even if cars cause environmental damage, we don't think it's that important, because the more important thing is the mobility that cars provide, and this is because, and you explain. So it's almost as if you can rinse and repeat number 3 and 4 several times to give yourself a very structured rebuttal. So that generally, right, is the structure of rebuttal that would allow you to respond to arguments from another team very, very effectively in a very structured way that gets the judge to credit them very well. Next. So I know this is a bit overwhelming because it's a big slide, and big slides are scary, but let's walk through it, especially if you might be a new debater, but let's walk through them. So remember what I talked about in terms of rebuttal outcome, right? However, X, and this, like, that little bit of the rebuttal is what you're trying to prove with the rebuttal you're making, right? There are 5 things broadly that you can try to prove. These 5 things can be split up into even smaller things, but I'll just crystallize them into 5 for the sake of time and for the sake of not driving everyone here insane. Number 1, the opposite of what they say will happen will happen. So I think I gave an example of this earlier, right? They said that banning cars will make things more environmental. Actually, they make things less environmental. Very straightforward. Sorry. Very, very straightforward. It takes the argument and goes, they say X will happen, but not X will happen. And then you prove it, essentially. And how you prove it will be subject of the next part of the discussion. The second type of, essentially, rebuttal is what they say will happen, but this is actually a good or a bad thing. An example of this might be this house would raise, this house would, this house would support a maximum wage, right? Now, let's say opposition makes the argument that this causes people not to have to work so hard, right? When people realize that, hey, I'm not gonna be able to get that much more money, I will stop putting in that many hours in work, and this causes them to not have to put in that much effort into work, right? So you can actually say, yeah, we agree that will happen, but that's not that bad. if we're talking about people who are sort of massive hustlers, participating in active hustle culture, working themselves to the bone, taking on additional side hustles, etc., it probably is pretty bad for your mental health, bad for your relationship with your family. It's probably pretty bad for you as a person overall. Therefore, the government stepping in and saying, okay, I respect that you want to hustle, but at some point, you're already making enough money and you're neglecting everything else in your life. It's probably a good thing. So you can flip essentially the importance of the argument that yes, we agree that X will lead to Y, but Y is actually good or Y is actually bad. So if a rebuttal is, so if the argument is a harm, you can say it's a benefit. If an argument is a benefit, you can argue it's a harm, for example. And trying to put a positive or negative spin on things and then justifying it like crazy is then the second type of rebuttal. And of course, you have to explain why, if assuming you make that rebuttal, you have to explain why, actually it is important for people to prioritize mental health, why the active choice to hustle yourself to the bone is probably a bad one or a poor one, probably because it is a result of harmful capitalist signaling that really hurts your ability to actualize as a person and to really form closer relationships, which most people report actually brings happiness in the long term as compared to short term satisfaction. These things probably are justifications that you have to provide later on. That's something you can do. The third thing is essentially a very straightforward thing. What they say will happen will not happen. Now, at this point, you probably noticed that I've assembled these in some order. The first few rebuttals are the most effective rebuttals, while the later rebuttals start becoming less effective. There's a reason for this. If you effectively flip an argument and you bring it over to actually the opposite of what they say is will happen, right? Then it's almost as if any amount of time the other team has spent trying to persuade the judge that let's say you explain that why will actually happen on your side, any amount of time the other team has spent trying to persuade the judge that why is a good or bad thing is effectively arguments that you've plucked from them. So if you're imagining like sandcastles, right, you've plucked their sand and dumped it onto your sandcastle to make yours seem taller than theirs. This essentially is a more effective rebuttal. So the lecture was very named for this reason. It's a more effective rebuttal than later types of rebuttals. However, there are instances where you cannot flip arguments. For example, let's say the debate was this house would abolish, I think school exams might be a good one. So there's very little realistic persuasive reasoning why a world without school exams will be a world where students feel more stressed than a world with school exams. For example, maybe there can be some logic there about how students are not quite sure how well they're doing. This might cause some level of anxiety. But as compared to the reports of mass crunching, the burning of midnight oil, the pegging of self-esteem to exam results that we see in the world with school exams, it's probably pretty hard to persuade a judge that the opposite is true, really. And it's very hard to persuade a judge as well that it is actually a good thing that students are stressed. There are ways to do it, I suppose. You could argue that students actually should be stressed to acclimate themselves to the real world, where project deadlines are a real thing. But there are some instances where it's hard to do that. And so if you notice that you cannot logically reason why the opposite is true in terms of importance or truth, right? You can try and negate stuff. So this is essentially what many debaters try to do. They go, don't worry, it will not happen. Now, to be clear, at best, if you manage this rebuttal, you will not swing an issue to your side. So if you imagine sort of like two bars, right, of where you are in the debate, at best, if your opposition's benefit is this much and yours is this much on this particular issue, while one or two might move it down, you're probably going to move it to be equal at most. And that's if the judge buys your argument. And if the judge doesn't buy your argument, you move it down a little bit. That's why it's less effective. But it's still useful because it then allows you to do the fourth and the fifth things. That is to say, well, is not that bad or good. Well, to be fair, number 4 is very similar to number 3. That is to say, the impacts are very, very small. But number 5 is critical if you're making number 3 and 4. That is to say, why what you say will happen is not that important and it will not happen that much. And therefore, this other thing, which you trade off a lot of, right, for some reason, is way more important than what you say is a priority in this debate. So, for instance, I actually think that there was another workshop on weighing by another one of the ASHCO, if I'm not mistaken. So, I suppose I'm going to be repeating a bit. This workshop is a bit broader than that one, in that I'm covering all rebuttals. But weighing, right, is an effective way to go, look, at the end of the day, given that whatever they provided is marginal, and I've sort of proven it in my speech, why is it then that this other thing, which you change a lot, is very important comparatively as a result? So let's get into how to do each of these. Number 1, flips. So flips allow you to essentially take the other team's arguments and turn them into yours, right? They are the most effective type of rebuttal, and I sort of mentioned this before. And they're definitely comparative. If done well, flips can win issues or even the debate, right? The way I can kind of tell that flips can do these things is because a lot of the times when I listen to adjudication calls, or even when I make these calls, oftentimes it is the flips that make me go, oh, the other team has essentially beaten them on this issue, right? So if you learn how to do this well, it essentially is a debate-winning rebuttal that can flip issues or even a whole debate. So how do you do these things? So number 1, you could accept the characterization but explain why it leads to the opposite result. What does this mean? In debates, right, characterization, it's oftentimes characterization, mechanism, outcome. So for example, in the instance of, I don't know why I'm talking about school examinations. Maybe because Singapore recently abolished some school examinations, the midterms. But school examinations, right, the characterization might be, well, school examinations cause stress because school exams lead towards because schools are necessarily very, very competitive. Students are very, very insecure at their young age, right? And schools are environments where students are learning things, and so it is obvious that students will begin comparing with each other, with their grades with each other, right? And therefore, given that students compare their grades, and given that school is so stressful, that students are so insecure, when school exams are a thing, it leads to students becoming very stressed. So, an attempted flip to this argument might be that yes, we agree that students are in a formative stage of their lives and they are very, very stressed, but given that that is the case, they become even more insecure when there are no school exams, because they're never quite sure how well they did for their exams, or how well they are at their subjects compared to their friends, and therefore this can cause a higher level of anxiety than in a world with school exams to sort of benchmark you. Or to give another example, let's say the debate were about banning sex work, let's say, right? And a prop argument might be that sex work causes STDs, right? And so an argument might be that, look, sex workers meet a lot of people. It is very dangerous to be a sex worker because it might lead to you getting exposed to many different people and many different clients. Therefore, this might lead towards you transmitting STDs amongst multiple clients, right? And this presents a public safety hazard. Therefore, we should ban them, similar to how we have basic safety standards and bans against, let's say, deliberately transmitting viruses. Now, the way to flip that argument, you could do a sort of combination of A and B. Yes, it is true that sex workers meet a lot of people. We agree with that characterization. However, given that sex workers meet a lot of people, in a world whereby it is banned and it's very difficult to regulate sex work, because all you really need to do is find another person, give them money, right? It's hard to regulate every single aspect of someone's life. That leads towards more spreading of STDs anyway. However, and this is where you give countervailing logic, right? when we legalize sex work, you can mandate that governments provide free STD testing for sex workers, can provide contraceptives, condoms, etc. That then leads towards right, sex workers having drastically lesser STDs. So it's actually in a world where sex work is banned that STDs become a big problem. So that's how you can flip that argument, right? That banning sex work leads towards lesser STDs. Actually, legalizing it decreases STDs, while keeping it banned increases them, right? So that's how you can flip the argument as a whole. So to be clear, number 1 and number 2 are both flips. It's just that they're different types of flips. So C, where you accept the entire causal chain of events, right, and explain why it brings unforeseen harms or benefits, is where you sort of take the outcome and say, this is actually good or bad, and try and reread it and sort of spin it in a new light. I cannot imagine a world where STDs are a benefit. There's no logic for that. But probably a better example might have been the idea of improving people's lives by stopping them from hustling too hard or contributing too much, right? Beyond what is like materially and psychologically feasible for them in the maximum wage example. That probably, right, will be a rebuttal that can show that yes, you can accept the entire causal chain of events, but it actually brings unforeseen harms or consequences to hustle so much and to work so much, right? If you're working so hard and you're grinding so hard that you actually hit a maximum wage, let's say the maximum wage is $5 million, the unforeseen harm or consequence is probably that in the long term you won't be so productive, right? You probably have physical ailments that will cause you to have a heart attack at 40 or something, right? And this probably will decrease your productivity or in the long term. So that might flip essentially the, actually, out of sheer habit, I'm going back to the first type of flip to try to flip the productivity idea, but possibly could also lead towards you having a poor relationship with your family, which is also another important thing. So essentially, a flip aims to take the other team's arguments and win it over to your side. And to be honest, I feel like I don't quite see this happening enough in the debating circuit as much as I'd like to. Debaters tend to go for the easy, not true rebuttal, which, fair enough, I mean, it does work, but a flip is more effective if you pull it off correctly, in that you can win on an issue rather than trying to prevent it from becoming a thing in this debate. Winning on it helps you win the debate more of the time. Yeah. Okay, at this point I've talked quite a lot, for about half an hour now. So I'd like to invite you all to ask any questions if you have any. I'll just provide a bit of space for that, just like a minute or two. Are there any questions? You can unmute, you can turn on your camera, you can I'll turn on my gallery view so I can see multiple people. You can do a little hand raise reaction, or you can send the question in the chat for everyone to see, or you can DM it to me. If the other side, interesting question. If the other side claims a benefit such as hope, which intuitively sounds good, should you claim that it's not true and hope is bad, or should you try to claim hope exists on your side too? I think that you want to try to flip hope to your side, right? So let's say they're defending something so intuitive that obviously you obviously cannot say it's a bad thing, right? Like hope, or we prevent climate change, right? These things are really hard to explain, right? Why it is actually good or bad, right? Rather, why it is actually bad. And if they claim, like, I don't know, they're saving more puppies and kittens, can't attack that, right? So to be strategic, what you want to do is actually try to claim that it exists more on your side, right? Being comparative is always important here. If you explain that it exists on your side too, it's sort of a bit like 3, I suppose, where it's like, oh, we have it too, but it doesn't, it sort of brings your bar up if you're visualizing it through a bar system, but it doesn't quite completely flip it. So you want to say either we have more of it, so that's flipping number 1, right? Or you want to, or you try to go, oh, it's not that important, not that amazing. Yeah. Please, as always, these outcomes of rebuttals are ideals to reach towards, but of course, please exercise a lot of caution and discretion. you should exercise lots of common sense. And if you feel like it's impossible to win on something, try to win on other things, or try to wash it out a little bit. So that brings me very nicely to the second thing, actually, the idea of not true. So let's say, right, you cannot logically commit to a claim. You read the motion, look at the thing, and you go, okay, it's impossible for me to persuade the judge that X doesn't lead towards Y, or leads towards more of Y on our side. So how do I then deal with this rebuttal? Well, to rebut that particular bit, you might then go into not true. So not true rebuttal is when you claim that what they say is going to happen will not happen. So notice that these rebuttals don't win issues, they wash them out, meaning they essentially try to make sure that there are non-issues in the debate rather than completely beating the other team on these issues. So thirdly, it then allows you to do the next thing, outweigh what the other team is saying. So remember the idea of the causal chain, right? That A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, right? That characterization leads to a mechanism, leads to an outcome. To do a not true rebuttal, you can just challenge the characterization. The argument is contingent on A. A is not true, the argument doesn't work. So an example would be this house regrets tiger parenting, let's say. Let's say the other team says we need tiger parenting because actually parents need to be strict with Asian kids, especially this house, Asian kids. Let's say the info slide said this house regrets tiger parenting among Asian communities. The other team says we need to be very strict about parenting because kids are lazy, and right, Asian people in particular are oftentimes poor because they immigrate into places like America from war-torn states, such as during the Chinese warring period or during the 1920s gold rush. Was it during the Qing Dynasty warring period? No, it wasn't. Regardless, they oftentimes flee during times of political instability, right? During the revolution, right? During the Cultural Revolution, so they flee during those periods of turmoil, and these are situations which are very, very harmful to them and also very impoverishing. So they often arrive poor, and because they're poor, they need to they basically need some strictness to sort of get them to study hard, to climb the social ladder, to have good discipline in work and ethics, and to get into good jobs and get into good universities, to adopt the primary language of the country, to interact well, etc. And that leads towards them being able to be successful. Tiger parenting is necessary for that. A prop not true rebuttal might be, it is actually not true that the majority of Asian people in America were poor to begin with. In actuality, because of the American Immigration Act, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1950s or 60s, right, actually only allowed, or mostly allowed in, Asians who already had college degrees. This meant that the majority of Asians were already educated, but the parents were still strict on them. The reason why is because they were overcompensating, right? The kids were already getting into pretty good universities, but Asian parents oftentimes overcompensate to try and get their kids to integrate into American society, and so they try to push them towards Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, etc. Right? Wait, they're not American. Harvard, Yale, whatever. Right? So as a result, it is not true that this was necessary to begin with, and it's just not true that we really need tiger parenting. Right? So that characterization doesn't really lead towards, right? Or the characterization doesn't really meet towards the outcome, that is to say, tiger parenting being necessary to begin with. Okay. Next, outweigh. So, when you outweigh an issue from another team, right, keep in mind that this is something you do after, or preferably after, you've tried your best to negate it. So don't try. So I recommend you against effectively leaving an argument as it is and then trying to weigh it out. You must always try to diminish the significance of an argument before going, but our arguments are more important. Remember what I said at the start, right? That if you simply respond to another team's arguments with your own arguments to begin with, that probably means that you have no other things to say against them. This is essentially almost the last step in a many step process, where you're like, okay, fine, judge, let's say you don't believe anything I've told you, why you should still side with my side, right? And this step is when you go, Okay, let's assume that um, what they're saying is true, that tiger parenting does lead towards better academic achievements, right? And to a certain extent, it does, right? There is some difference between like good, decent colleges and like Harvard, for example, right? Um, so you want to be honest and try and go, okay, this is exactly where our arguments are, right? At this point, the difference, there is some difference actually, but um, the reason why you should still give it to the proposition overall is because the harms of tiger parenting still outweigh this difference between, let's say, whatever college you got and the ideal college. So for example, let's say tiger parenting causes trauma, right? That your kids have a poor relationship with their parents, they are insecure, they're anxious, they're possibly depressed. All of these things, right? And the horrible side effects of these, right, into their social lives, etc., right, are more important than the marginal benefit you get to their education in the other team's world. In this instance, I'm sort of doing number two. Your issues affect people in a more important way. In this instance, importance of mental health, psychological wellness, etc., as compared to income, right? Or you could sort of or if you want, you can sort of explain why your issues affect more people. Your issues target a more vulnerable actor, or your issues are prior to other teams' issues. So given that there's already a workshop ongoing, I'm not going to go too deep into these. Number one and two and number three are just very intuitive. If your arguments impact more people, let's say the other team's arguments are about a particular minority, you can go, look, if your economic policy hurts everybody in the country versus a select few of people, select few number of people, right? It's just more important that we protect more people. Or if you impact people in a greater or more important way, then that's probably pretty persuasive as well, right? Or if you impact a more vulnerable actor, right? And this actor is particularly needy, etc., then probably you want to talk about why we should prioritize these particular actors. Maybe because if their lives are bad, then intuitively we as a society should sympathize with them more and prioritize getting their lives to be a bit better of a state. And lastly, your issues are prior to the other team's issues. So I've heard this sort of thrown around as and unelaborated, but what this usually means is you can only get B if you already have A. Without A, you can't get B. Therefore, you should prioritize A over B. So for example, you can only really do well in school if you have some level of mental health, right? If your mental health is kaput, then you're not going to do well in school anyway. So why not prioritize mental health, not only because of the benefits it can provide you, but also because it leads towards better school, let's say, right? So it is logically prior and logically necessary to get A in order to have B as well. So that's essentially how you can sort of outweigh things by explaining the relative importance of each other other things in the debate. Cool. So I believe that brings me almost to the end. I think I've just got couple more slides. Right. So this is just general advice for rebuttals. Number one, start during prep time. I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. Never just go, what is the other team gonna say? Who cares? We'll just focus on our arguments. I've had debates where I cannot tell what the other team will say. That's not necessarily a good thing because I have not done very well at those debates. Because usually if I can't quite tell what they're gonna say, but they're pretty smart debaters, right? They will come up with cases which I never anticipated, and therefore I'm only reacting on the spot, and that's not a good position to be in. So what you should try to do as much as possible is to go in your prep and go, okay, what are my arguments? And try to develop your own arguments first, of course, but also consider what they will say, what we will say in response to what they will say, what they will say in response to what you will say, and what you will say in response to what they will say about what you will say, right? I know, lots of words. Basically, think of rebuttals against their arguments and against their rebuttals as well. And when you have those prepared, right, you kind of see what is really important as well. And this will bring me to my second thing. You will essentially start noticing that there are going to be parts of their argument which are logically weaker, right? For example, in a motion, this house supports a carbon tax, right? Obviously, it is very, very hard for Op to prove that climate change isn't bad. It is not going to be strategic. It cannot explain why climate change is good. I cannot imagine any logical reason why carbon dioxide or having more carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide in the air is a good thing. So probably the pivot will be something along the lines of why a carbon tax causes people to be upset and causes them to reject other climate change efforts, for example, right? Or it raises cost of living too high and therefore causes people to be very antagonistic towards all efforts to stop climate change. Therefore, carbon tax is not effective to stop climate change, let's say. But it's very hard to explain why climate change is good or not bad, because it will obviously hurt a lot of people. And so trying to find that weakest bit is important. I call it the pivot, or I think of it as a pivot. Don't have to if you don't want to. This is the terminology I use internally. And as a side note, if you start noticing that issues will start hinging on certain things or certain ideas, right? You can consider those things pivots as well. So for example, let's say your arguments, let's say the motion is, this house believes that universities, or this house supports Western universities setting up branches in developing countries, right? So probably the prop will have some arguments about how, or in authoritarian countries, let's say, the prop will probably have some arguments about how setting up universities there leads to some level of liberalization. They'll spread liberal ideas. They'll teach people about important social values, improve the quality of education. The op will probably argue something about how these universities will restrict freedom of speech in them. There's authoritarian governments. Of course, they will not be allowed to do that. Of course, you have lots of government crackdowns. It will effectively become a way to legitimize the government and the regime, etc. And so notice that these arguments, you can only really believe one of the two, because they are chains of events that cannot both simultaneously exist. Therefore, you want to try to draw them back and go, okay, what is the thing that stops me from believing in A and makes me believe in B, or stops me from believing in B and makes me believe in A? And that's like the pivot, right, where I could go to either side. And for me, perhaps that might be something along the lines of, who has more negotiating power? Who has more power in this relationship? The government or your US universities? You can argue that the government has more power because they are the ones who can kick universities out and justify doing so with relatively little impunity, with relatively high levels of impunity. So for example, if they can say things like, oh, we kick them out because they are against our social values, they're a bad influence on people, and the society will just accept it usually, because they might be conservative as well. But universities, if they have a campus closed down, lose lots of money, and their shares and their donors will be not happy as a result. And so that probably is going to be a reason, right, why an argument, right, might pivot to one side versus another side. And you give more reasons, right? For example, universities need money and they get lots of income from students. Governments don't really need foreign universities that much. They usually have local universities, etc. So being able to realize that, look, these two arguments or these two issues cannot coexist. They hinge on me believing in one thing more than another thing. And in this instance, that one thing is this idea that who has more power. Identifying that and proving that a lot can be very helpful, even in the prep time, right? To realize where this debate will go and realize like the road to why you will win this debate in particular. Thirdly, giving multiple reasons. And so if you want to give multiple reasons why something is, remember all the outcomes I gave, right? Of all of these things. For each of them, you can give multiple reasons. You can give reasons why the opposite of what they say will happen. You can give different ones. So, for example, the opposite of what you say will happen. But even as say it did happen, this other thing is more important. You can mix and match, right? Do keep in mind that some of these, if used in tandem, will be contradictions. So, for example, you cannot say that, let's say number 2 and number 3 and number 1 cannot be used together, for the very simple reason that you cannot both argue that something will not happen and also that, look, yeah, it will happen, but it's a good thing, for example, right? Like that's just not how like you can do things without causing some level of tension in your case. Um, but generally, it is advisable if you are a bit more experienced and you're willing to do it, and you think that you can do the win, and you can explain these things effectively to a judge, right? To give multiple logical reasons why something is the case or is not the case. Um, Number fourthly, it's a bit of advice. If you cannot think of a rebuttal, what I sometimes do is I will put on a no, they are wrong hat, meaning I'll think no, they are wrong. I will now believe that they're wrong, even if I believe that they're right, they're wrong. Here's why, and then I push myself to give a reason. And when I force myself to do it, I oftentimes find that I'm able to then come up with these reasons. And finally, number 5, right? Be willing to make trade-offs, right? Trade-offs. Be very willing to outweigh things and to sort of realize that, hey, my rebuttals can't really work because either they made the argument very well, or my rebuttals don't quite make sense. If that happens, then you might want to start trading things off and going, no, yeah, we agree that they might win on this issue, but this other issue is so much more important, and here's a whole bunch of reasons why, and justify it like crazy, right? Yeah. Okay, we have about 13 minutes left. This is what we'll do with the last 30 minutes. Q&A. First, I'll do a Q&A. So let's see. I think. Wait. Yeah, I'll just do the standard system, whereby I said earlier, if you have any questions, you can send it in the chat, DM me, send it in the chat, raise your hand, unmute, turn the camera, yeah. So the irony of asking me that question, because I have done theater before. How do you make your rebuttals more theatrical, given that you have already flipped or beat your opposing team's arguments? My actual recommendation is that theatricality doesn't always work. Like for me, it's almost like there's different possible styles that you can use to win sort of the favor of the judge. Some debaters are very analytical, they're very calm, they're very nice. Some are not. I tend to fall into the not category, because when I do try to be calm, I just come off as boring. Actually, in retrospect, that means that this lecture might not have been that amazing experience to go through, who knows. But in terms of providing theatricality, if you want to do it, right, you can go, and therefore, right, no, actually, you can try to vary your volume, your speed, and therefore this argument is just not true. You slow down to emphasize certain points, you adjust the pitch and tone, you use downwards inflection to make yourself seem more certain, right, etc. So that is something that you could try using, essentially, that will make yourself seem more theatrical. Theatricality doesn't always work, so not every judge is biased theatricality. Some judges see it as like unnecessary fluff. It doesn't matter, as long as you think that the rebuttal works for you and makes you feel good, I recommend you go for it. As long as you don't sound like you're vomiting absolute gibberish and you're speaking too fast or something, it's probably fine. Yeah, I've gotten way too much feedback that I speak really fast. Would I recommend could I recommend a training routine? Yes, absolutely. So one possible way to train by yourself, right, if you have no teammates with you, is to go online and find videos of debaters. I highly recommend WSDC videos, because they are the national teams of countries, and they are very, very good usually. I recommend you watch them, and what you can do is you can watch the debater, and when he or she they are done with their speech, I'll talk about downwards inflection later. You can pause the video, deliver your rebuttals, you can record yourself delivering rebuttals, and then you watch the next speaker and you go, oh, that's how I should have responded, or that's how I could have responded. Yeah. So a downwards inflection is essentially a manner of speech that goes like this. So it's almost like the pitch of your voice goes from higher to lower. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be as dramatic as myself going like this. However, probably it will go like this. That's a little bit lower at the end, and you do it all the time. When you make sentences and I want to seem certain, I do this to make myself seem more certain. If I want to make myself seem like I'm asking a question, I do this, and I make myself seem a bit more uncertain. I've met debaters who always do this, and I have coached debaters who always do this, and I call them out all the time on it, and they're not quite sure what to do with it. Yeah. But yeah, making yourself use downwards inflections can often make yourself seem more confident and certain. Next. Any questions to ask yourselves to make sure your rebuttals are complete? I think that very good question. The way I do it, I don't know if this is effective for everyone, is to sort of imagine, do I think this is enough to give myself the win? Almost, right? Like, is there a logical path to victory based on these rebuttals? And if, for example, you don't manage to like negate important things that still stand in the debate, probably you want to try and go for these things. You want to try to imagine almost like where you are vis-a-vis the other team, right? Imagine that sandcastle and try and do it. Oh, sorry, I'm getting like Telegram messages. Try and imagine the sandcastle basically and what you really need to hit. If you can imagine that what you said, number one, achieves important outcomes of flipping important arguments and negating important arguments, etc., and sort of explains why your arguments are more important, so that you already done enough of these things to sort of go, okay, I cannot imagine myself winning if the judge buys what I said, and then it's logical enough and has enough reasoning and enough facts and enough ideas to show that the judge will believe what you said, you're probably good. Yeah. So if I can imagine myself winning and a judge sort of explaining how I won, I will then go, okay, I've done enough for this issue. Do keep in mind that you want to try to not overdo a particular issue. For example, if you identify something as the most important thing and you go after it with all your heart, and then later in the judge feedback they go, yeah, you've won on that, but I gave the other team the win based on this other thing, then it feels bad. But yeah, that's why you want to try to pace your time. How do I know where to draw the line between having a lot of analysis and not when they're repetitive when I'm rebutting? Very good question. If each sentence adds something new, I'm probably okay, right? And this is something that was taught to me during essay writing that I realized I was doing in debate as well. Whereby if I write an essay, right, I notice that I've done this so much in my Malay essays and my English essays for SPM because I was told that you have to have them be long and longer essays are better. Why is Gontong Royong or why is campaigns to clean up things good for society? They are good because they build teamwork. Teamwork is good for society. Society benefits a lot from teamwork. Therefore, teamwork is good. If you notice that you're just saying the same sentence over and over again rephrased, you're probably being long-winded and repetitive. But if you notice that each sentence is adding a new idea, teamwork is good because it builds community spirit. Community spirit leads towards more willingness to donate money to each other in times of need. More willingness to donate money to each other in times of need leads towards more happiness and satisfaction. When you add more things each sentence, you're probably not being repetitive and giving more analysis, which is probably good. Of course, try to avoid giving unnecessary analysis. If you're just word vomiting your way there, then there really is kind of like no points essentially. In that if you just keep adding more and more outcomes, for example, you probably have a pretty weak proof of why an argument is true, right? Like 7 minutes is a lot, right? And so I'll talk about that. Good question. 7 minutes is not a lot, and at the end of the day, if you count the amount of things that you have to do in a given debate, right? You have to win on the arguments, you have to defend your own arguments, you have to attack on their arguments, you've got to weigh things, you've got to attack their policy, you've got to explain your own policy possibly, you have to make a defense, you have to call out contradiction, you have to respond to POI, you have to patch up the first speaker's POI because they didn't respond to it properly. Now you've got to help out. All of these things, right, are a lot. And so being very careful to provide just enough stuff that you're not repeating yourself is, believe it or not, one of the fastest ways that I found myself improving as a speaker recently. Because when you do that, you can effectively turn your 7-minute speech into a 30-minute speech when otherwise it might have been a 3-minute speech being repeated twice with some additional fluff. Yeah. Any advice on making rebuttals more robust when coming up against different rebuttals that target different angles? Yeah. Well, let me think. So I think that advice on making rebuttals more robust is sort of what I've been doing the whole session, so providing reasoning and logic, and this is stuff that, believe it or not, is similar to arguments, right? Like arguments are made strong by providing additional characterization or additional causal factors, meaning new causes, right? So additional facts that prove your argument is true. Same as rebuttals, there's no logical distinction between them actually, right? If if you are making an argument and you're providing substantiation for an argument, there's no logical reason why you don't do the same thing with your rebuttals. It's just that your rebuttals, for instance, just in the head of the share that speak, just aim to prove that the other team's arguments are wrong, or aim to beat the other team on their argument. So there's actually no logical reason why you ought to distinguish the two. However, right, so that's how you can make them more robust and believable, by providing reasoning and logic and characterization, much as you would in an argument. But what about when you're trying to come up with different rebuttals to target different angles? Oh, good question. So hold on, let me just move my presentation back to the slides. Oh wait, that's way too far back. Because to me, they don't have that many slides. They just stuff each slide with a bunch of stuff. So let's say you're trying to come up with multiple angles, right? So generally, I almost have these things as a sort of checklist in my head. And the way to get there is really just a whole lot of training, really. A whole lot of spars, a whole lot of drills. Out of habit, you're already trying to go flip, negate, outweigh. Can I flip this? No, how do I stop it from becoming that big an issue? Or, like, how do I explain why we weigh up against them more? I don't do it all the time perfectly, right? I'll be first to admit. But it's almost like when you do debate and practice enough, it becomes like an instinct where, like a basketballer, right, might instinctually try to get the ball in a certain position and then run in the court. Same here, right? It becomes like instinctual. Then I go, okay, what's the response? I'll try and flip this. Ideally, how do I flip this? How do I flip this? How do I negate it? I don't want this to be a big thing. I want to go not true. Okay, how do I explain it's not that big a thing? Okay, how do I weigh it against my own thing, right? Given that, how do I then go? So it's almost like it becomes a habit over time. The more training you do and the more times you try to rebut arguments, and it became more apparent for me than when I moved on from first speaker to second and third speaker. Because after secondary school, I ended up becoming more of a second speaker, and then doing more third speaker positions as well when I go to uni. All of these things, the sort of things that you end up getting very, very used to over time. Yeah, and you end up sort of internalizing the different steps you can possibly take, and recognizing when these steps can fit together, right? If these steps, at the end of the day, you can use all of these as long as they are not contradictory, right? As long as you can go, okay, this doesn't quite contradict with this one, therefore I'm willing to run it, right? Then there's no like limit as to how many of these rebuttals you can make, as long as you follow the structure, preferably. Try to recap the logic, it's always helpful. Yeah. So I believe that brings us almost to the end of the conversation. So I originally did have like a possible activity plan, but it doesn't really matter because we have like 2 minutes. Yeah, are there any last questions? Going once, going twice. Cool. So yeah, that pretty much brings us to the end of the conversation. We can stop the recording now. I don't think that I'll be talking about anything that will be like